Alright guys, so I wanted to make a quick video here to kind of just go over lab number 8. I'm going to post a key, like a paper key that I have written for you as well, but just wanted to kind of go over some of the questions. So if you did, if you did miss points on lab number 8 and you're curious why you missed points on lab number 8, this is going to be a great resource for you. So let's just jump right in here. So pre-lab activity number 8, first question, the idea that two alleles for a trait are separated into different gametes during meiosis, that is independent assortment, right? When we have those homologous chromosomes lining up on the metaphase plate and then they separate, splitting the cell from diploid into haploid cells, that's independent assortment. That's when those alleles are separating into different gametes. So independent assortment there. The term's genotype. So genotype is the genetic makeup of an individual. So your combination of alleles, homozygous dominant or recessive, heterozygous, that's the genotype. And then the phenotype is the physical characteristic. They are related because the genotype is what determines the phenotype. So that's what those terms mean there. Question number 3, whatever you predicted here is totally fine. I wasn't looking for anything specific as long as you made a prediction for each of these traits on the pre-lab. All right, moving into the actual lab activity. So the first part is just working with some probabilities. So if you have a coin and you flip it one time, what are two possible outcomes that you're going to get? So you're going to get heads or tails, right? Those are your two possible outcomes. What is the probability that the outcome will be heads? That's going to be 50%, right? You have an equal chance of getting a heads or a tails. One isn't more probable than the other, so it's a 50-50 chance there. 50% probability the outcome will be heads. So then you needed to flip a coin 20 times and record your results here, and then calculate the percentage of times it landed on heads. So to do that, you take the total number of tally marks there in your heads box and divide it by 20, or the total number of coin flips. So if you had 8 tally marks here, you would divide 8 by 20. You get 0.4 or 40% for the percentage of times the coin landed there. So is this close to the probability you predicted in number 2? So we predicted 50% in number 2, and if we got 8 heads out of 20, that's 40%. That's pretty close. It could be closer, but it's not bad. Does the first toss have any influence on the second? It does not. Does the third have any influence on the fourth? It does not, right? When you flip a coin one time and you flip a coin another time, they are completely unrelated events. All right, so then it talked about a couple of probability rules here. So the rule of multiplication and the rule of addition. These can be a little confusing, so I like to think of them with the words and or. So the rule of multiplication, the probability, sorry, my dog just dropped her bone. The probability that two independent events will occur together is equal to the product of the individual probabilities of each event. So if we have event number 1 and event number 2 happening, the probability of both of those events happening, 1 and 2, we're going to multiply those individual probabilities together to get that overall probability. And then the rule of addition states that the probability of 2 or more mutually exclusive events will occur together is equal to the sum of their individual probabilities. So this is where we use the word or. So if we have event 1 happening or event number 2 happening, those two individual probabilities, if you add them together, you get the total probability of both of those events happening. Okay? So in question number 8, the probability of, if we flip 2 coins, that both of them will be heads, we are going to have the probability that coin number 1 is heads and the probability that coin number 2 is heads. So this and that, we're going to multiply those individual probabilities together. So 50% for one coin being heads, 50% for the second coin being heads. We multiply 0.5 times 0.5, we get 0.25 or 25%. Question number 9 is also going to be 25%, right? This is exactly the same as question number 8, except it's just with tails instead of heads. The math is all the same. And then question number 10 down here, this is where we're using both of our rules, multiplication and addition. So what is the probability that one coin will be heads and the other will be tails? So we could have coin number 1 be heads and coin number 2 be tails. So coin number 1 is heads and coin number 2 is tails. That's a 25% probability there. Or we have coin number 1 be tails and coin number 2 be heads. So that's another 25% probability over there. So if we have this event or that event happening, that's addition to mutually exclusive ways that this outcome can happen. So a 25% probability or a 25% probability, we add those together, it's a 50% probability that we will have one heads and one tails. So if we flip 2 coins simultaneously 20 times, we record our results there. So I need you to do that and then fill out your percentages. We don't have our class data, so as long as you had numbers and percents there, that was good for me. So the next part was doing some Punnett squares. So our first Punnett square here, we have our short genotype, which is little t, and then we have our tall genotype, which in this example is big T, so a homozygous dominant and a homozygous recessive. So if we cross those in this Punnett square, all of these boxes, when we fill them in, are going to be heterozygous because we're getting one big T from this individual and then one little t from this individual. So all of those are going to be heterozygous. So the F1 genotypes, all heterozygous. The F1 phenotypes are going to be all tall because a heterozygous individual is going to have that dominant phenotype. So a tall phenotype here for the F1 generation. And are there any short plants in the F1 generation? No, we don't have any short plants in that generation. So in our next cross, we're crossing 2 of the heterozygous individuals. So when we do that heterozygous cross here, we're going to get a homozygous dominant here. We're going to get 2 heterozygous individuals, and then we're going to be getting a homozygous recessive individual here. So the F2 genotypes, 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous, 1 homozygous recessive. The phenotypes, this is going to be our 3-to-1 phenotypic ratio, so 3 tall to 1 short. And then down here, do we have any short plants in this generation? We do, right? This box right here is going to be our little t. So we've got a 25% chance of getting a short plant in this cross. So now this Punnett square is talking about the probability of having a boy or a girl for each conception. And this is talking about in humans. So if we have our XX up here on the top and then our XY down here on the side, these 2 boxes are both going to be XX, and these 2 boxes would both be XY. So a 50% probability of having a boy and a 50% probability of having a girl. Question number 21, suppose dad wants a boys basketball team. What are the chances of having 5 sons in a row? Okay, so if we want to look at the probability of having 5 sons in a row, it's going to be the probability of having 1 son, which is 50%, and the probability of having a second son. So we're using the word and, that means we're going to multiply. So 50% or 0.5 times 0.5. The probability of having a third son is going to be 0.5. The fourth and the fifth is also 0.5. So we're just taking 0.5 and we're multiplying it for each son. Okay, so we're doing 1 son and another son and another and another and another. So when you multiply all those together, you end up getting, it's right around 3%. 0.03125. So when you convert that into a percent, it's right around 3%. That's the chances of having 5 sons in a row. So part 3 goes through some various traits that you needed to observe. So we're not going to go through all of these traits individually, but you can check the key to double check that you got all the genotypes correctly if you want to do that. So anytime we have a dominant phenotype, the 2 genotypes for that is going to be the homozygous dominant and the heterozygous. And the genotype for somebody who has the recessive trait is going to be the homozygous recessive. And then parts C and D for each of these, they varied depending on what traits you do or don't have. So as long as you filled those out, you got credit for them. But the actual answer varies depending on what you got. So you needed to do that for all of those traits there. And then, unfortunately, we don't have the class data, so we couldn't fill that out. Discussion question number 1, we also couldn't answer. We really can't answer number 2 based on the results of our class, but we can kind of answer the second part here. Is the dominant phenotype always the most common? If we scroll back to one of these traits, polydactyly, this is probably the best example we have in the lab here. So having extra fingers or toes is dominant to having 10 fingers and 10 toes. But the majority of people aren't polydactyl, right? They have 10 fingers and 10 toes. So even though that's a dominant phenotype, it's not necessarily the most common. So this isn't necessarily true. The dominant phenotype is not always the most common. Is the dominant phenotype always the most desirable? No, not necessarily. I think it depends on what one individual says is desirable or not. So this is not true. The dominant phenotype is not necessarily more desirable than the recessive. Question number 4, Jane Doe is pregnant with her 4th child. She already has 3 daughters, therefore she is certain that this baby will be a boy. Using what we know about probability and from part 1 of this lab, what is the probability that she's going to have a boy? The probability she's going to have a boy is still 50%, right? It has nothing to do with the children she's had in the past. It's still 50% chance of having a boy, 50% chance of having a girl. So it has no bearing on the 3 daughters she's already had. She could have a boy, she could have a girl, 50-50 chance there. Then question number 5, we've got freckles. They are a dominantly inherited trait in humans. Bob has freckles like his father, but his mother does not have freckles. Maria has freckles like her mother, but her father does not have freckles. So Bob and Maria are both going to be heterozygous individuals because they have one parent with freckles and one parent without freckles. So they know that that parent without freckles is contributing that recessive allele, but they have the dominant trait, so they have a dominant allele also. Dominant allele from the parent with freckles, the recessive allele from the parent without freckles. So when we cross those in a Punnett square, the genotypes of their offspring, we have a 25% chance that their offspring would be homozygous dominant, 50% chance their offspring would be heterozygous, and a 25% chance that their offspring would be homozygous recessive and not have freckles. So is it possible for Bob and Maria to have 4 biological 2 children with freckles and 2 children without freckles? It is possible. Okay, so every time we are mixing these genes together, mixing these alleles together from Bob and Maria, we're getting that Punnett square. Okay, so each time they have a child, there's a 25% chance that that child can have freckles or not have freckles, and a 75% chance that they can have freckles. So it's still possible, right? They could have 2 children that have freckles, and then the other 2, when they have that 3rd child, a 25% chance that that child won't have freckles. Child number 4, still a 25% chance that the child won't have freckles. Okay, right? Those Punnett squares, we're starting over on those Punnett squares every time we have a child. Okay? So if you go through this video and you go through the key and you still have questions, feel free to let me know. But otherwise, you can look forward to more videos. I'll try to go over the labs as we go and the homeworks as well. So make sure you're keeping up on all of those assignments.